On a spring evening in 1921, over 400 people crammed into a high school auditorium in Battle Creek, Michigan, to witness an annual student oratorical contest where one girl and one boy would be crowned winners. Merze Tate, a 16-year-old Black girl, stood in front of that predominantly white audience and proclaimed into their silence that, quote, "For 244 years, my ancestors were held in bonds of slavery, deprived of every opportunity for mental development, civil expression, and hindered in their pursuits of human endeavor, and saw continued hatred and denial after emancipation. But in the time of global war, whites had called upon 2 million Black men from Africa, this is still heard, from the West Indies and from America, to fight that the world might enjoy the benefits of civilization. They fought as men, they fought nobly, they fought gloriously. Despite that," she argued, "they were still denied liberty and the privileges of democracy." She reached back to anti-slavery rhetoric that deftly deployed the image of the heroic Black soldier, and I'll quote from her. "It was a Negro soldier that Wendell Phillips, immortal statesman and orator, said, but 50 years hence, when truth gets a hearing, the muse of history will put Brutus for the Roman, Hampden for England, Fayette for France, choose Washington as the bright consummate flower of our earlier civilization, and John Brown, the ripe fruit of our noonday. Then dipping her pen in the sunlight, will write in the clear blue above them the name of the soldier, the statesman, the martyr, Toussaint Louverture." Miss Merze Tate, a colored girl, was the winner for the girls' division of the contest, her subject being the Negro in the World War, reported the Battle Creek Inquirer the next day. And for me, and I start the book with this passage, this event really marks the start of her public career, a public career that she would forge in the world that routinely disrespected Black women and men as intellectual, political, and moral inferiors. So this is the central task that this book takes up, to rescue Tate's life and her legacy from an obscurity imposed by the virulent racial and gender politics of the academic world, both in her lifetime and in ours. For sure, who Tate was and how she was able to live a fulfilling life and do all that she did is fascinating, and that drives this narrative. For me, only by excavating and critiquing her scholarship can we understand the life of her mind. While I'm also not going to cover 5 decades of her writings, but I will give you a quick sense of what she was interested in and what she worked on. Her earliest writings, which come in the 1930s, take us into debates among African Americans about how best to educate Black college students for the political challenges facing them. She paid special attention to the preparation of Black women students and how to balance the demands of personal life with professional ambitions, regardless of whether the woman married or remained single or whether she became a mother or not. She also was an early advocate of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, so-called STEM fields for Black students, hoping that the sciences might somehow be less susceptible to bias from race and gender. Her lifetime of scholarship, which does span many eras and many regions, is not rooted primarily in a critique around ideology and class, although that is certainly in there, but is tethered theoretically to what should be called an anti-racist geopolitics. She applied her critique to the history of the arms race and the US annexation of Hawaii, as well as the then contemporary developments in India and Asia, the entire Pacific region, and in Africa. I'm just gonna read a couple of little bits so you can hear her voice a little bit more than mine. All right, and speaking of travel, one of the things that she does in the 1930s, she's teaching in a high school in Indianapolis. She's made her first trip abroad, and she takes a group of, she's a high school history teacher. She takes a group of Black students, about 40 of them, from Indianapolis on a train to Washington, D.C., and shows them everything possible. They stay at Howard, they stay at the Whitehall Hotel, because this is certainly, she's got to navigate all the rules of segregation and Jim Crow, and she gets them there and back. They have a great time. She then writes and publishes an article, and this is This is actually the earliest published thing by her that I found. And it's called Should Colored Children Travel? And then she's describing the response of people to this two train cars of young Black students, and I'll show you a picture of them. White and colored alike marveled at the splendid conduct of the group. The dining car waiters, who would have all been Black, appeared to be bubbling over with joy. They stated it was the greatest pleasure they had had to serve two dining cars of well-behaved, educated colored youth. Compared with white groups of students, one waiter declared that our children were perfect. The railroad's representative spoke of the attractiveness and the neatness of our coach when it arrived in Washington after 43 had occupied it for 19 hours. The fact that she is writing this, but also having to make the case for Black students being able to do this, it captures the moment, but it also shows the centrality of travel as an educational tool and her investment as well in that travel club. At Oxford, she's there from 1932 to 1935. She takes an exam for her degree, and she does not, and she fails it. And this is the dark secret of her life. It took me a long time to figure out that happened because she covered it. It's the one thing that I know she covered up. And this will tell you why, I think, to some extent. So she's writing to the people at Oxford. I should say, it is not unusual to fail that exam the first time through. It was the first time she ever failed anything in her life. So she was a straight A student, the best student at all of these predominantly white institutions that she'd gone through. So this was a real stab in the heart. And so she's writing to the head of that college she's in. She says, if ever another young colored woman should try to come up to Oxford, I hope that you will judge her on her own merits and not think of me and all the trouble I caused. There are hundreds of colored women in America who would come up to Oxford and be successful, though they would have money enough to live free from financial worries, and she did not have money enough, and brains sufficient to pass any examination. It is most unfortunate that I, as a pioneer, had to face so many difficulties and then not succeed. It is the first great failure of my life, but I am anxious that others should not suffer because of my failure. She went on and took the exam the next year and got the degree and became the first Black American to get a graduate degree from Oxford. And one of the things that she's proud about is that Elaine Locke had been the first Black Rhodes Scholar, as many of you will know, and he came back and claimed to have had a degree, but he never got the degree, and she knew that. And she was one of the few people who understood the system well enough that would be legible to her. So she was very, very invested in being the first Black person to get the degree, and she got it. And I'll just conclude with this, which is to say that one of the big struggles of her life, as you can imagine, being a woman at Howard in the 1940s, and this is not an attack on Howard. I give Howard credit because it was one of the few institutions that was actually hiring women in the 1940s. And so she engaged in a very aggressive fight there always for gender equality or against gender inequity there, and talked at great length about how she was overburdened as a teacher and also as a woman who was required to chair the department twice, including once before she was actually even in a permanent position, required to teach 25 different courses. So the men get all the perks and the women do not. This also seems familiar. And that was the real constant struggle of her life at Howard the whole time she was there.